wretchy, barren little thing. Did you really believe I'd let a hollow womb sit on my throne?" Those were the words Caelan spoke, and Eowyn felt them land like a blade, sliding cleanly between her ribs. She had come down the west stair in her stocking feet, meaning to surprise him with warm bread and the good news the healer had whispered to her only that morning. Instead, she stood frozen in the shadow of the archway, one hand pressed flat to the cold stone, and listened to the man she had bound her soul to reduce 12 years of loyalty to a single cruel dismissal. The mate bond that lived in her chest, that low golden hum she had felt every day since the night they'd first run beneath the harvest moon, guttered like a candle in a draught. It did not go out. It did something worse. It flickered, and in the flickering she understood that he had already turned away from it long before this morning. Her knees wanted to fold. She did not let them. Blood drained from her face until her lips felt like paper, and still she stood, silent, listening, learning. In the great hall beyond the arch, Seraphine laughed, that bright, practiced, glittering laugh, and Eowyn heard the rustle of silk as the woman crossed to lay her palm against the king's chest, where a queen's palm belonged. And in that suspended, ringing quiet, Eowyn made herself a promise so quiet it barely stirred the air. Not a scream, not a plea, a vow. "You will remember this morning," she thought, "for the rest of your long life. You will remember it as the day you had everything and traded it for nothing and did not even know you were doing it." She did not weep in the corridor. She would not give the stones that satisfaction. Instead, she turned, slow and deliberate, and walked back up the west stair with the tray still balanced in her hands, the bread still warm, its yeasty sweetness now nauseating in her nostrils. She set it down on the sill of the tall arched window where the morning light came in, grey and thin over the pine-dark valley of Hollowmere, and she looked out at the kingdom she had spent a decade holding together with her own 2 hands. The pack lands rolled away toward the mountains, silvered with frost. Somewhere out there, the border patrols were changing shift, the ones she had reorganized. The granaries she had ordered, filled against the coming winter, stood squat and full at the valley's mouth. The treaty with the river packs, the one that had ended 40 years of blood, bore her seal beside his, because she had ridden 3 days in the rain to broker it while he hunted. All of it hers, all of it unremembered, all of it about to be handed to a woman whose only labor had been to look beautiful and to want. Eowyn pressed her hand to her own belly, still flat, still secret, and felt the tiny, impossible flutter of the truth she had carried down that staircase to share. Barren, he had called her. He did not know. He had not asked in months, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her by how little it hurt, that she would never tell him. Not now. Not ever. The child she carried would not be raised in a house that measured a woman's worth by her womb, and threw her away when the counting went wrong. For a long moment she allowed herself to remember the boy Caelan had been, because she needed to bury him properly before she could leave. She remembered him at 19, all restless muscle and thunder, standing over his father's pyre with his jaw set and his eyes wet, whispering to her that he could not do this alone. She remembered choosing him, not because he was the strongest wolf in the northern reaches, though he was, but because in that moment of grief he had reached for her hand and not for a weapon. She had believed, God help her, that the reaching hand was the true him, and the thunder was the performance, She had spent 12 years pouring herself into the space between the two, softening his edges, catching his mistakes before they became catastrophes, absorbing his temper so the pack never saw it, translating his silences into the language of a ruler. She had made him great, and greatness, she understood now, watching the frost burn slowly off the valley, is a poison to a small man. It had made him believe the myth of himself. It had made him think the light came from inside him, and not from the woman standing behind the throne holding a lamp. The healer's name was Maren, and Maren had been the one to press the truth into Elowyn's palm at dawn, folding the young queen's fingers over it like a secret coin. Old Maren, who had birthed half the pack and buried the other half, who had served 3 kings and feared none of them, who watched everything with milky, knowing eyes, and said little. It was Maren, Elowyn realized, who would need to be told, not the truth of the child, but the truth of the leaving, because Elowyn was leaving. The decision had arrived not as a storm, but as a settling, the way snow arrives, silent and total, changing the shape of everything without any violence at all. She would not fight Seraphine for a throne built on a man's contempt. She would not stand in a great hall and let the pack watch their queen beg. She would take nothing that Kaelin had given her, not the crown of braided silver, not the rings, not the title that had never truly been an honor, but only a leash with jewels on it. She would take only what was hers by right and by labor, and she would disappear so completely that when the world finally understood what it had lost, there would be no road left to follow her down. But it was not the overheard cruelty that broke something final in her. It was what she found 3 nights later, when the leaving was already half arranged, and her heart had already gone quiet and cold as a stone at the bottom of a well. She had gone to the east wing, the old disused wing, where nothing had been kept but dust and broken furniture and the ghosts of the previous dynasty, because she needed a place to hide the small trunk of her true belongings until the moon-dark night she had chosen for her flight. She carried a single candle. She expected cobwebs and silence. Instead, she pushed open a heavy door that should have shrieked on its hinges and found it moving, smooth and oiled, and beyond it, warmth. Beyond it, lamplight. Beyond it, a room that had been transformed. The walls had been painted the soft blue of a summer dawn. A cradle stood beneath the window, hand-carved, the wood pale and new, the blankets folded within it, edged in the royal thread reserved for heirs of the direct line. A rocking chair, a shelf of carved animals, a tapestry half-finished on its frame, showing a wolf and a moon, and beneath them, in threadwork just begun, a name. Not her name, never her name. The thread spelled out the beginning of a word, and the word was the name Seraphine had chosen, and Elowyn understood in one silent, gutting instant that this nursery had been built for the mistress's child, in secret, in the heart of the house Elowyn had built, while everyone smiled at her over supper, and called her their queen. She stood in the doorway with the candle trembling in her fist and did not make a sound. The scent of fresh cut pine and beeswax and new wool filled her lungs, and it was the scent of a future that had been planned around her and without her, a future in which she was already dead. Someone had spent months on this room. Someone had commissioned the cradle, chosen the paint, arranged for the tapestry, all while she rode in the rain and filled the granaries and held the border. The pregnancy was not a rumor then, not a possibility she had been spared. Seraphine was already carrying. The nursery was not a hope, it was a countdown, and the barrenness Kaelin had flung at her in the great hall was not cruelty born of a moment's frustration. It was the rehearsed language of a decision made long ago, a story he had been telling himself to make his own betrayal feel like justice. She reached out and touched the edge of the cradle with 2 fingers, the way you might touch the face of someone in a coffin, and then she withdrew her hand as if the wood had burned her. The candle flame steadied. Her breathing steadied. Something inside her that had been thrashing all week finally lay down and went still, and out of that stillness rose the last of her grief and the first of her purpose, welded together into a single unbreakable thing. That night she did not sleep. She sat at the window of the Queen's chamber with her hand on her belly and made her plans real, turning them from wishes into logistics, from grief into a route. And when the sky began to pale toward the false dawn, she rose, dressed in plain travelling wool the colour of bark and stone, and did the last thing the Queen of Hollowmere would ever do inside those walls. She took the crown of braided silver from its stand and laid it in the centre of the great bed. She took the rings from her fingers, every one, and set them in a neat row beside it. She took the deed of dower, the parchment that named her share of the pack's wealth, and she left it too, untouched, unclaimed, because she would owe this man nothing and take nothing his hands had given. She left only her wedding cloak folded over the footboard, and on top of it a single sheet of paper on which she had written nothing at all, a blank page, because there were no words left that he deserved, and because a blank page would haunt him longer than any accusation. Then she blew out the candle, lifted her small trunk, and walked out of the room, down the west stair, past the arch where she had learned the truth, and into the cold before morning, and she did not look back, because looking back was for people who still believed there was something behind them worth seeing. Maren was waiting in the kitchen yard as they had arranged, wrapped in a shawl the colour of ash, her breath smoking in the dark. The old healer said nothing for a long moment, only reached up and cupped Elowin's cold face in her warm, gnarled hands, and Elowin felt the whole weight of a lifetime of service and silence pass between them in that touch. "You knew," Elowin whispered, "about the nursery. You knew." Maren's milky eyes did not flinch. "I knew," she said, "and I could not tell you, child, because you would not have believed me until you saw it. Some truths must be walked into. Words bounce off a hopeful heart." Elowin almost laughed, and the laugh came out as a single cracked sob she caught in her fist. "It stopped hoping now," she said. "Good," said Maren, and pressed a small heavy pouch into her hands. Coin, old coin, gold that did not bear Caelin's seal, gathered over years by an old woman who had seen too many queens discarded to believe this one was safe. "There is a wagon on the Millbrook Road," Maren went on, low and quick. "The trader Bevin owes me his youngest daughter's life. He will carry you to the river port and ask no questions and forget your face by the time he's home. From the port there are ships. You have a strong back and a sharper mind than any man in that hall, and there is a wide world that has never heard the name Hollowmere. Go and let it not hear yours either, until you choose." And Elowin, who had walked out of a palace with nothing, understood that she was not leaving with nothing after all. She was leaving with the one thing the palace had never offered her, the loyalty of a person who wanted nothing from her but her survival. They did not embrace long. There was no time, and Maren was not a woman for long embraces. But before Elowin climbed the low wall to the lane where the trader's wagon waited, the old healer caught her sleeve one last time. "There is a thing you should know," Maren said, and now her voice dropped even lower into the register she used for the deepest truths, the ones spoken between women in the dark. That woman did not come to this valley by accident. "Seraphine!" She came with letters of introduction from the Varos Concord, from the money-lenders and land brokers of the southern reaches, the ones who have spent 20 years buying up ruined packs the way a man buys apples off a barrow. Your Calon thinks he chose her. He didn't choose her. He was chosen. And when the child is born and the bloodline secured, the Concord will hold a claim on Hollowmere that no army can break, because it will be written into the cradle. Elowen went very still in the dark. She thought of the tapestry, the half-stitched name, the future built around her absence. Then he is not the enemy, she said slowly. He is the fool. He is both, said Maren. But the fool is the one you were married to. Remember it if you ever come back this way. Now go, before the light finds you. And Elowen went, over the wall and into the wagon, and out along the Millbrook Road, the frost-white valley of Hollowmere, sinking away behind her into the dark, and she did not look back, and the world outside those mountains remained entirely ignorant of what it had just gained. 6 months later, on the far coast, in the sprawling salt and smoke city of Calden Harbour, no one had ever heard of a barren queen. What they had heard of was a woman named Wren, for Elowen had taken the name of a small brown bird that goes unnoticed until it sings, who had arrived at the harbour with a strong back, a sharp tongue, and an uncanny gift for making broken things run. She had walked into the counting-house of the merchant consortium that ran the Eastern grain trade and offered to solve, for a single week's wages, a bottleneck at the river locks that had cost them a fortune every season for a decade. The clerks had laughed at her. The master of the house, a shrewd old widow named Ottoline Vase, had not laughed. Ottoline had looked at the plain woman in the bark-coloured wool and seen, beneath the mud of the road, the unmistakable posture of someone who had once given orders to men who owned mountains. "You've run something large," Ottoline had said, "larger than this." And Wren had answered, evenly, "I ran it into the ground, trying to save it. Give me your locks. I don't make the same mistake twice." She had solved the bottleneck in 4 days. By the end of the month, she was managing the consortium's entire upriver logistics. By the time the sea ice cleared in spring, she was Ottoline Vase's second, and the old widow, childless and tired, had begun to speak of her the way a woman speaks of an heir. The transformation was not magic, and it was not luck. It was labour, the same relentless, competent labour Elowen had poured into Hollowmere, only now poured into ground that gave something back. In Calden Harbour, no one asked her to smile while men took the credit. No one measured her by her womb. Ottoline, who had buried 2 husbands and outlived every man who ever underestimated her, ran the consortium on one iron principle. Value is what a person builds, not what a person is born or bound to. Under that principle, Wren flourished like a plant moved out of shade. She learned the grain routes, the shipping tariffs, the delicate diplomacy of the harbour guilds. She learned which harbour master took bribes, and which took only respect. She learned the vast, slow machinery of money, how it moved, who held it, where it pooled, and where it drained. And somewhere in that learning, she came across a name she had heard once in the dark, in a kitchen yard, from an old woman's mouth. The Varos Concord, the money-lenders and land-brokers of the southern reaches. She found their name in the consortium's ledgers, in the register of competitors, in the whispered warnings of merchants who had been ruined by them. The Concord did not trade in grain or timber or silver. The Concord traded in debt. It found proud, isolated territories, old packs, old holdings, old families rich in land and poor in coin, and it lent to them generously, patiently, and then it waited, and then it collected, and what it collected was everything. Wren read the pattern the way she had once read a battle map, and her blood, which had gone quiet and cold 6 months before, began very slowly to warm again. Not with grief, and not with rage, but with the clean, bright heat of understanding. She had not gone looking for revenge. She wanted the viewer, had there been one, to understand that clearly. She had built her new life for its own sake, for the child growing round and heavy inside her now, for the plain, honest satisfaction of work that mattered. But the world has a way of folding back on itself, and the deeper Wren went into the machinery of the Eastern trade, the more the machinery kept handing her the threads of her own past. She learned that the northern packs were in trouble, all of them, the whole mountain confederation of which Hollowmere was the jewel. She learned that a hard winter had followed by a wet spring had rotted the seed grain across the highlands, and that the packs, too proud to beg from their old rivals, had turned to a southern lender who offered easy terms and asked only for a small pledge of future harvests as security. She learned the name of that lender, and she learned, from a shipping clerk who did not know he was speaking to the last Queen of the North, that Hollowmere itself, rich, proud, mismanaged Hollowmere, had borrowed more heavily than any of them, because its new king was pouring silver into a lavish celebration for the birth of his long-awaited heir, and its treasury, once the fullest in the mountains, had been emptied by a woman's ambition and a man's vanity in a single reckless year. Wren sat with that knowledge for a long time in the little room above the counting-house where she slept, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, the fire burning low. She thought about the granaries she had filled, and the treaty she had brokered, and the border she had held, all of it undone in the space of a single winter by the two people who had thrown her away. She thought about the blank page she had left on Caelin's bed. She thought about the half-stitched name in the nursery, and she found, examining her own heart with the same cold precision she brought to a ledger, that she did not want to burn Hollowmere down. That would have been easy, and it would have felt like justice, and it would have been the small revenge of a small soul. What she wanted was larger and slower and infinitely more satisfying. She wanted to be the one holding the debt when it came due. She wanted Caelin to look up in the moment of his ruin and see standing over him not an enemy army, not a rival king, but the woman he had called a hollow womb, the woman he had discarded, holding in her steady hands the parchment that owned everything he had. She did not want to defeat him. She wanted him to understand. So she went to Ottoline Vas, and she laid the whole thing out. Not the personal history, not yet, but the opportunity. The Varos Concord is overextended in the north, she said, spreading the ledgers across the old widow's desk in the amber light of a harbour dusk. They've lent against next year's harvests across the entire mountain confederation, betting that the packs will fail and forfeit the land. But they've made a mistake. They've concentrated too much of their capital in one region, and they've done it on the assumption that no one else can reach those markets before they collect. The mountain passes are closed half the year, but the river isn't. She tapped the map. We control the river. If we move seed grain up the water route this spring, cheap grain, honest grain, at terms the packs can actually pay, we break the Concord's leverage before the debt matures. The packs recover, they pay us instead of forfeiting to them, and the Concord is left holding paper that isn't worth the wax on its seal. Ottoline studied the map for a long, silent moment, and then she looked up at her second with an expression Wren had never seen on her before, something between pride and suspicion. "This is a great deal of trouble," the old woman said, "to save a pack of proud mountain wolves who would spit on a harbour woman in the street. Why do you care about the north, Wren? You've never once spoken of it, and yet you know its passes, and its granaries, and its treaties as if you'd walked them." And Wren, who had kept her silence for 6 months, looked the only person who had ever truly seen her in the eye, and decided at last to be seen the whole way. "Because I built them," she said quietly. "The granaries, the treaties, the border. I was the queen of Hollowmere, Otterline, and the man who threw me out to make room for a Concord puppet is about to lose everything I gave him. I'd like to be the one who catches it when it falls." Otterline Vase did not gasp, did not exclaim, did not treat the revelation as anything other than a piece of unusually valuable information, which was one of the 10,000 reasons Wren had come to love her. The old widow leaned back in her chair, laced her fingers over her narrow chest, and regarded her second for a long, weighing moment. "A queen," she said at last, without inflection, "in my counting house, solving my river locks for a week's wages." "A former queen," Wren corrected. "I resigned the position. I left the crown on the bed and walked out through the kitchen." A dry, appreciative sound escaped the old woman, almost a laugh. "You left the crown on the bed," she repeated, savouring it. "And the rings? The dower? All of it. I took nothing his hands had given me." Otterline nodded slowly, as if a suspicion she had carried for months had finally been confirmed and filed. "That," she said, "is why I trusted you the day you walked in, muddy off the road, and told me you didn't make the same mistake twice. A woman who takes what she's owed I can respect, but a woman who refuses to take what she's owed, on principle, when she's cold and hungry and alone, that woman I can build an empire with. Because she cannot be bought, and a person who cannot be bought is the only kind of partner worth having." She rose, poured 2 small measures of dark plum liquor, and pressed one into Wren's hand. "So, we are going to war with the Varos Concord over a mountain full of ungrateful wolves, and you are going to captain it, because you know that country in your bones. But understand me, Wren, or whatever your name is. If we do this, we do it clean. We do not cheat. We do not lie. We do not do to those packs what the Concord would do to them. We win because we are better, or we do not win at all. Those are my terms." And Wren, who had spent 12 years married to a man who had never once offered her honest terms about anything, felt her throat close, and she raised her glass and said, "Those are the only terms I'd accept." The campaign began quietly, the way the best campaigns do, with grain and paper rather than with fire and steel. Through the thaw and into the early summer, while Wren's belly grew and her time drew near, the consortium's shallow draft barges moved up the great river in long, patient trains, carrying seed grain harvested and stored honestly the season before, and everywhere they touched the Mountain Confederation, they offered the same thing, a lifeline that did not double as a leash. The terms were generous but not foolish. Otterline had drilled that into her, that mercy without arithmetic is just slow suicide. And one by one the smaller packs, who had signed with the Concord out of desperation and had spent the winter dreading the collection, seized the chance to climb out from under the Southern debt. They paid off the Concord's principal with fresh consortium loans at half the interest and 1/10 of the menace, and where the Concord had planned to harvest whole territories in forfeiture, it found instead only its money returned, coldly, cleanly, with nothing to show for a decade of patient predation, but a modest profit it had never wanted. The Concord had never wanted profit. It had wanted land and dominion, and the slow accumulation of a mountain kingdom, and Wren, sitting in the harbour with her ledgers and her barges, took the land out of its reach one honest transaction at a time. But she left Hollowmere for last. She did it deliberately, the way you save the deepest cut for the moment your hand is steadiest. She let the news reach her in pieces through the spring and summer, that the great celebration had indeed been held, that Caelan had spent silver like water on it, that Seraphine had been crowned in Elowin's place before the assembled packs in a ceremony of unprecedented lavishness, that the treasury of Hollowmere, once the envy of the north, had been drained past the point of recovery. And then, at last, the news she had been waiting for, carried up the river by a barge captain, who repeated it as a piece of amusing gossip, and did not understand why the harbour woman went so very still when she heard it. The child had been born, Seraphine's child, the long-awaited heir, and it was a daughter, and the Concord had come to collect. Because here was the thing the barge captain didn't know, the thing Caelan had never understood, the thing that Maren had tried to warn a hopeful heart about in a kitchen yard 6 months and a lifetime ago. The Concord's contract with Hollowmere had never been secured against the harvest. Caelan, drunk on his own future, dazzled by the woman the moneylenders had sent to dazzle him, had signed a pledge far worse than any of his neighbours. He had secured the debt against the succession itself. The clever, poisonous language of the contract, which Wren obtained a copy of through channels Otterline had spent 30 years cultivating, stipulated that if Hollowmere defaulted, the Concord's claim would attach not to the land, but to the office, to the throne, to the pack right, to the ancient authority of the Alpha line. The Concord didn't want to own Hollowmere's fields. It wanted to own Hollowmere's crown, and through the crown, the Confederation. And it had manoeuvred Caelan into signing that crown away without his ever once reading the clause that mattered, because he had been too busy admiring the woman who had brought him the pen. Seraphine's child was not the heir to Hollowmere. Seraphine's child was the collateral, and the nursery that Alaun had found in the east wing, that pretty blue room with the half-stitched name, had not been a home, built for a beloved daughter. It had been a vault, dressed up as a cradle, holding the deed to a kingdom. When Wren finished reading the contract, she sat for a long time in the quiet of the counting-house, with her hand pressed to her side, where her own daughter had begun, in these last heavy days, to turn and press against her ribs, as if impatient to see the world. She thought about the 2 children, hers growing in exile, unclaimed and safe and loved, and Seraphine's, born into a palace, crowned in silk, and sold before she could open her eyes, and the last of Wren's anger toward the newborn, which she hadn't even known she was carrying, dissolved entirely, and in its place came a resolve harder and cleaner than anything she had felt yet. She would break the Concord, not for revenge against Caelan. He had become almost incidental, a fool who had authored his own ruin, but because somewhere in the palace of Hollowmere there was an infant girl who had been born a hostage, and Wren, who was about to become a mother herself, could not leave a child in a cage, even if it was her enemy's child, even if it was the child the nursery had been built for, the child whose coming had been the countdown to her own erasure. This was the thing that separated her from all of them, and she knew it, and she let it define her. They built cages. She opened them. She went into her labor on the longest night of the summer, in the little room above the counting-house, with Otterline Vase holding one of her hands, and a harbour midwife holding the other. And it was long and it was hard, and at the end of it there was a daughter, red and furious and perfect, with a cry that filled the whole building and made the old widow weep for the first time in 20 years. Wren held the child against her chest in the grey dawn light and pressed her lips to the small hot head and whispered the promise that all the grief and all the strategy had been building toward. "I have you," she said. "I have you. You're safe. No one will ever build you a cage and call it love. I promise you that. I promise you that." And she named the girl Lark, because a lark sings on the way up, climbing, unafraid, higher and higher into the open sky, and because she wanted her daughter to know from her very name that they were people who rose. Downstairs, the barges were loading for the last run of the season, the run up the river to Hollowmere, and Wren looked out the window at them over the top of her sleeping daughter's head. And she thought, soon. Not yet, but soon. Meanwhile, in the mountains, the world Kaelin had built was coming apart, and the terrible thing, the thing that fed Wren's slow, cold patience, was that he could not see it happening even as it happened, because he had spent so long believing his own myth that he no longer knew how to read a warning. The palace of Hollowmere had never been more splendid or more empty. Seraphine, crowned and radiant, walked its halls in queenly silk, and found that the servants who had once loved Elowen served her with flawless courtesy and stone-cold eyes. The granaries Elowen had filled had been emptied to pay for the coronation feast, and the harvest that should have refilled them had rotted in the wet spring, and the treaty with the river Pax, the one Elowen had ridden 3 days in the rain to broker, had quietly lapsed, because Kaelin had insulted the river Alpha at his own coronation by seating him below the salt, and no one had been there to smooth it over, because the woman who used to smooth things over was gone. Small cracks. Kaelin stepped over them one by one, telling himself they were nothing, telling himself a king did not concern himself with granaries and seating arrangements, telling himself that the woman who had once handled such things had been a useful drudge, and nothing more, easily replaced, already replaced, unmissed. He told himself this in the great hall, and in the council chamber, and in the wide, cold bed where he now slept alone more nights than not, because Seraphine, it turned out, had never wanted a husband. She had wanted a throne, and the throne was won, and the man who came with it was, to her, a piece of used furniture. It was in the deepest part of a bad night, some months after the birth of his daughter, that Kaelin first felt the phantom pain. He woke from a dream he could not remember with his hand pressed to the center of his chest, and a sensation there like a wound that had healed wrong, a dull, persistent ache in the exact place where, for 12 years, he had felt the warm, golden hum of the mate bond, and never once thought to be grateful for it. He had severed that bond himself, had spoken the words in the great hall that a man speaks to unmake a mating, had done it coldly and publicly to make room for the woman the Concord had sent, and at the time he had felt nothing, because a thing you have never valued costs nothing to destroy. But bonds, it turns out, do not die all at once. They die the way a great tree dies, slowly from the inside, and the pain comes not in the cutting, but in the long, cold season afterward, when the leaves fail to return, and you finally understand what you felled. Kaelin lay in the dark with his hand on his chest and thought, for the first time in a year, of Elowen, not of the drudge he had told himself she was, of her hand in his over his father's pyre, of the way she used to know what he needed before he knew it himself, and provide it without being asked, and never once demand credit, of the blank page she had left on his bed, which he had crumpled and thrown in the fire in a rage the morning he found it, and which now, in the dark, he would have given a year of his life to read, because he understood at last that the blankness had been the whole message. There was nothing left to say to you, and he had not even been able to hear that until now. He began, quietly, to make inquiries. Where had she gone? He asked the steward, who did not know. He asked the guards, who had not seen her leave. He asked Maren, and the old healer looked at him with her milky, knowing eyes, and said, "The dead don't leave a forwarding address, Your Majesty," and turned back to her herbs, and something in the flatness of her voice frightened him more than a curse would have. He tore the palace apart, looking for some trace of her, some clue, and found only the east wing, and the nursery, the beautiful blue nursery he had commissioned in secret for Seraphine's child, and he stood in it now with new and terrible eyes, and saw it for the first time as Elowen must have seen it. A countdown, a coffin, a message that she had already been erased. He remembered, with a lurch of nausea, that the room had been finished weeks before he ever spoke the words of unmaking in the great hall. She had known. Before he told her, she had known, because he had built the evidence of his betrayal into the heart of the house, and never once imagined she might walk into that disused wing and find it. He sank into the little carved rocking chair, meant for a nursing mother, and put his face in his hands, and the phantom pain in his chest flared white and total, and for the first time in his adult life, the Alpha King of Hollowmere wept, alone, in a room built to hold a hostage, mourning a woman he had thrown away and could not now find, in a kingdom that was quietly, invisibly, being repossessed beneath his feet. The reckoning came, as all reckonings come, with a knock at the door. It was autumn again, a full year and more from the frost-white morning Elowen had walked out through the kitchen, and Hollowmere had passed from crisis into catastrophe. The seed grain had never been replaced. The winter stores stood at a third of what they should have been. Two of the smaller packs in the Confederation, seeing which way the wind blew, had quietly withdrawn their loyalty and begun trading with the harbour consortium that had saved them from the southern debt. Kaelin had spent the last of the treasury, and then borrowed against the next of it, and the day arrived, as Wren had known to the very week that it would, when the Varos Concord came to collect. They did not come with an army. They came with lawyers, 3 of them, grey men in grey coats, riding up the mountain road in a plain black carriage, carrying leather satchels stuffed with the patient, poisonous paperwork of a decade's predation. They were shown into the great hall, the same hall where Kaelin had once called his queen a hollow womb, and they laid the contract on the long table, and they explained, in the flat, courteous language of men who have never once lost, that Hollowmere was in default, and that per the terms Kaelin himself had signed, the office of the Alpha Line, and all the authority attached to it, now passed to the Concord, to be administered through the person of the heir, the infant girl in the blue nursery, whose guardianship the Concord would of course assume. Seraphine, they added, with the faintest grey smile, had been most helpful throughout, and her continued cooperation would be well rewarded. And Kaelin, standing at the head of the table where his father and his father's father had ruled, understood at last, fully and completely, and far too late, that he had never been a king at all. He had been a mark. He had been chosen, seduced, hollowed out, and harvested, and the woman he had thrown a kingdom away for had been the blade in the Concord's hand the entire time, smiling at him over supper, while she carried the debt that would eat his throne. He did the only thing a proud man does when the ground gives way beneath him. He raged. He roared that he would not honour the contract, that he would throw the grey men off his mountain, that no scrap of southern paper could command the Alpha Line of Hollowmere. And the grey men waited, unmoved, until his fury spent itself against their patience, and then the eldest of them said quietly, You are, of course, free to refuse, your majesty. But the debt does not vanish because you shout at it. It has been sold. Calen went still. Sold, he repeated. Sold, the grey man confirmed, and permitted himself another thin smile. The Varos Concord, facing certain, reversals in the northern markets this past year, has divested itself of its mountain holdings. Your debt, along with the deed to the office of the Alpha Line, was purchased 3 weeks ago by a private buyer, in full, for coin. We are here merely to effect the transfer. You no longer owe the Concord anything, your majesty. You owe everything to someone else. And that someone, he added, gathering his grey coat about him as he rose, has asked to collect the debt in person. She is, I understand, already on the river. The barge came up to the water stair of Hollowmere on a cold, bright morning in the full flame of autumn, and the whole pack gathered on the banks to see it, because word had run through the valley like fire that the mysterious buyer who now owned the very crown was arriving, and no one knew who she was, and everyone was afraid. Calen stood at the top of the water stair in his finest cloak, the cloak of the Alpha, and beside him stood Seraphine with the infant in her arms, both of them pale, both of them for the first time uncertain, and behind them stood the whole assembled court that had watched a queen be discarded, and had said nothing. The barge was long and low and elegant, flying the colours of the harbour consortium, and at its prow stood a woman in a travelling cloak the colour of bark and stone, and as it drew close and closer and finally kissed the stone of the water stair, that woman lifted her head and pushed back her hood and let the whole valley of Hollowmere see her face. And a sound went through the crowd, like wind through wheat, a single indrawn breath from 1,000 throats, because the servants knew her, and the guards knew her, and the old ones on the banks who had loved her knew her, and the name they breathed was not Wren. It was Elowen, the queen who had vanished, the queen who had left the crown on the bed and walked out through the kitchen and disappeared into the wide world, and who now stood at the prow of a barge that owned the very ground they stood on, holding in the crook of one arm a bright-eyed infant girl of her own, and looking up the water stair at the man who had called her a hollow womb, with an expression of perfect, terrible calm. Calen could not speak. The phantom pain in his chest, the dull ache he had carried for a year, flared into something so acute he pressed his hand to it without meaning to, and Elowen saw the gesture and understood it, and did not soften. She came up the water stair slowly, unhurried, one hand steadying the child on her hip, and the crowd fell back to let her pass, and the grey lawyers, waiting at the top, bowed to her, actually bowed to the woman this court had thrown away, and that small motion said everything about who held the power now. She stopped 3 steps below Calen, close enough to speak without raising her voice, and for a long moment she simply looked at him, at the fine cloak and the grey face, and the trembling hand pressed to his chest, and at the beautiful hollow woman beside him, clutching the infant that had been born to be collateral. "You look tired," Elowen said at last, quietly. "Ruling is harder than it looks, isn't it? All those granaries, all those treaties, all those small, tedious things a king shouldn't have to concern himself with." Calen's mouth worked. "Elowen," he managed. The things I said. I remember what you said," she cut in, and her voice didn't rise, and that was what made it terrible. "Every word. I've carried it a long way. I built a life on it, actually. So let me say it back to you, since you seem to have forgotten." She took 1 step up, so that they stood nearly level. You told a hall full of your people that you would not let a hollow womb sit on your throne." She let the words hang in the cold, bright air. Then she shifted the bright-eyed baby on her hip so that all the valley could see the child, and she smiled. And it was not a kind smile. "As it happens," she said, "the womb was never the problem. The problem was the man who couldn't see what was standing behind his own chair, holding the lamp. And now," she lifted the leather satchel in her free hand, the one that held the deed, "the throne is mine, not because I married it, because I bought it, in full, for coin, from the men you sold it to." Seraphine found her voice then, high and sharp with panic, and stepped forward. "You can't do this," she said. "There are agreements, there are protections, the conquered promised." And Elowen turned her calm grey gaze on the other woman, and Seraphine's words died in her throat. "The Concord," Elowen said, "is gone from these mountains. I drove them out one honest loan at a time, while you were choosing curtains for a vault. They sold your debt to be rid of a losing position, and they sold your promises along with it. You have no protectors left, Seraphine. You were a blade, and the hand that held you has thrown you away, exactly as it threw me away. And I imagine that stings, so I will not belabor it." She looked at the infant in Seraphine's arms then, and for the first time something in her face changed, something opened, and it was not toward the mother but toward the child. "This one, though," she said softly, "this one owes you nothing, and me nothing, and did not ask to be born into a cage. That is the only reason either of you is still standing on this mountain, because I remember what it is to be sold, and I will not do it to a baby, not even yours, not even here." And then Elowen did the thing that no one on the banks of Hollowmere ever forgot, the thing they told their children and their children's children, the thing that separated the true ruler from the false one for all the years that followed. She turned from Caelan and Seraphine, and she faced the assembled pack, the 1,000 people crowded along the water stair and the banks, the people whose granaries she had filled and whose border she had held, and who had watched in silence as she was cast out. And she spoke to them, not as a conqueror, but as the queen she had always quietly been. "I own the office of the Alpha Line," she said, and her voice carried now, clear and strong across the water. "I own the debt, the deed, the crown, all of it. By the letter of the contract this man signed, I could take everything, tear it down, or rule it as a tyrant from a harbour 100 leagues away, and never set foot here again. That is what the Concord would have done. That is what he," she did not look back at Caelan, "nearly let happen to every one of you. But I am not the Concord, and I am not him." She lifted the leather satchel high so the sun caught it. "So here is what I will do instead. I forgive the debt of Hollowmere, all of it. Not to Caelan, to you, to the pack. The granaries will be filled before winter. I have barges on the river already. The treaty with the river packs will be restored. I brokered it once, and I will broker it again. And the office of the Alpha Line I return to the pack itself, to be held in trust for the only person on this mountain who is guilty of nothing." She turned then and looked at the infant in Seraphine's arms, and her voice gentled. For her, raised free, raised honest, watched over by people who will not sell her. That is my judgment, and it is final, and it is mercy, which is a thing this house forgot how to give a long time ago. The silence that followed was absolute, and then it broke, not into cheering, not at first, but into weeping, the deep, involuntary weeping of people who have been afraid for a very long time and have just been told they are safe. Old Maren pushed through the crowd, her milky eyes streaming, and Elowen came down the last steps of the water stair and put the free arm, not holding her daughter, around the old healer's shoulders, and the two women who had stood in a cold kitchen yard a lifetime ago held each other on the stones while a kingdom wept around them. Cailan stood alone at the top of the stair, forgotten, unaddressed, stripped of every source of power he had ever believed was his, the crown given away, the debt forgiven over his head, the pack's love flowing past him toward the woman he had discarded like a river routing around a stone. He had wanted, in the long cold nights of his phantom pain, to be seen by her again. Now he was seen, fully, by everyone, and what they saw was nothing. Not a villain grand enough to hate, just a small man who had held greatness in his two hands and let it walk out through the kitchen, and had never even known it was leaving until it came back, owning the ground he stood on. He came down the stair at last, slowly, and the crowd let him pass the way you let a ghost pass. And he stopped before Elowen, and he did not try to command her, because he had learned at least that much. "I have no right to ask you anything," he said, low and broken. "I know that. But the child, my daughter, will she—" "She will be cared for," Elowen said, not unkindly. "Better than you would have managed. She'll grow up in a hollow mare that is honest and full and free, and she will never know that she was born to be sold unless someone is cruel enough to tell her." She looked at him then, really looked, for what they both understood was the last time. "You asked once what I would do if I found out what you'd built in the East Wing," she said. "You never asked, actually. You never imagined I'd find it. But you built the cradle, Cailan. You commissioned every board of it, and you dressed a hostage's vault up as a nursery and told yourself it was love. You built the cage." She shifted her own daughter, her lark, higher on her hip, and the baby laughed at the bright water, unafraid. "And I bought the whole mountain it stood on. Remember that. In whatever life you make from here, you built the cage. I bought the lumber yard." And she turned and walked up the stair, and didn't look back, because looking back was for people who still believed there was something behind them worth seeing, and there was not, and there never had been. Seraphine did not last the winter in Hollowmere. Stripped of the Concord's backing and the crown she had schemed for, exposed before the whole pack as the instrument of a foreign predator, she found the halls that had once flattered her now unbearable, and she left as she had come, in a plain carriage on the southern road, though this time no one bowed and no one lied about how helpful she had been. Where she went, no one knew or cared. The infant girl stayed, of course, raised in the open by Maren, and a household of women who had loved the true queen, and she grew up bright and unafraid, and never once slept a night inside the blue nursery, which Elowen ordered dismantled, the cradle broken up for firewood, the walls repainted, the half-stitched tapestry with its poisoned name unpicked thread by thread until nothing of the countdown remained. As for Cailan, he stayed too, though he was king of nothing now. He lived out his years in a small house at the edge of the Packlands, tending a garden, doing honest small work of the kind he had once been too proud to notice, and the Pack neither honored him nor tormented him, but simply, mercifully, forgot him, which is the fate of small men who mistake a lamp's light for their own. Sometimes, on cold mornings, he would press his hand to his chest where the phantom of the broken bond still ached, and he would think of a blank page, and he would understand, all over again, that there had been nothing left to say, and that the nothing had been the truest thing anyone had ever told him. Elowen did not stay to rule Hollowmere in person. That had never been the point. She had reclaimed it not to possess it, but to prove that it could not be taken from her, and having proven it, she gave it freely back to the people who had earned it, and returned to Caldon Harbour, and to Otterline Vase, and to the wide, honest life she had built on the far coast with her own 2 hands. She raised her daughter Lark by the salt water, in a house with no cages in it, and the girl grew up climbing the rigging of the consortium's ships and doing sums faster than the clerks, and singing, always singing, on the way up. And in time, when old Otterline finally set down the weight she had carried for so long, the whole Eastern grain trade passed into Elowen's hands, honestly, in full, earned and not inherited, and she ran it by the one iron principle the old widow had taught her, which was the same principle a small king in the mountains had never understood, that worth is not granted by those in power and cannot be taken away by them either, that it is built and proven and reclaimed on one's own terms, that a person who cannot be bought is the only kind of person worth becoming. She had walked out of a palace with nothing but a pouch of unmarked gold and a secret in her belly, and she had turned the nothing into an empire, not out of revenge, but because the nothing had finally set her free. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the cold of that frost-white morning and the warmth of that harbour dawn, if some part of you stood a little taller when Elowen pushed back her hood and let the whole valley see her face, then take a moment before you go and sit with the reason it moved you. Because somewhere inside, almost every one of us, there is a version of that woman on the staircase, listening to someone we trusted reduce us to nothing, choosing in that ringing silence whether to scream or to survive. Elowen chose to survive, and then she chose something harder and rarer than survival. She chose to build. She chose to refuse the small, hot, easy revenge that would have burned a kingdom down, and to reach instead for the slow, cold, patient work of becoming someone the world could not throw away. That is the lesson worth carrying out of this story and into your own life, whatever staircase you happen to be standing on right now. Loyalty cannot be bought, and it cannot be commanded, and the people who mistake your quiet competence for weakness are telling you the exact size of their own imagination, not the size of your worth. When someone shows you that they have already decided you are disposable, when you find the nursery they built for the life that does not include you, believe them the first time. Do not argue. Do not beg. Do not spend one more year of your one and only life pouring yourself into a house that has already measured you for a coffin. Walk out through the kitchen if you have to. Take nothing their hands have given you, and go build something on ground that gives back. Because here is the truth that Elawan understood in the flickering of a dying bond, the truth that took Kaelin, a ruined kingdom, and a lifetime of phantom pain to finally learn. Strength is not inherited. It is not conferred by a crown or a title or a marriage or a name. Strength is built, board by board, and choice by choice, in the cold and in the dark, by people the world has counted out. The man who was handed a throne lost it in a single winter. The woman who was handed nothing turned the nothing into an empire. And then, and this is the part that matters most, the part that separates the true rulers from the false ones for all the years that follow, she used that empire not to cage her enemies, but to open the cage of an innocent child who owed her nothing. That is what power is for. Not to make others small so that you can feel large, but to make sure that the next frightened person on the next cold staircase has somewhere to run, and someone waiting in the kitchen yard with a pouch of unmarked gold, and a warm hand on a cold face, and the words that change everything. You are not trapped. There is a wagon on the road. Go. So let me ask you, before the light finds us both, and this story slips back into the wide dark where all stories live. When you pictured Elowen at the prow of that barge, pushing back her hood while 1,000 people breathed her name, did some part of you stand up inside your own chest? Did you feel, even for a moment, the shape of your own vanished worth coming back up the water stair to collect what it was owed? If you did, then this story was for you, and I need you to do 3 small things with the feeling before it fades. First, tap that like button, because it is free and it is quiet, and it tells the great grey machinery of this platform to carry stories like this one to more people who need to hear them. Second, and this is the one that truly matters, share this with someone you love who is standing on their own cold staircase right now, someone who has forgotten that they are the lamp and not the shadow, someone who needs to be reminded tonight that they cannot be thrown away by anyone who never understood their value in the first place. Send it to them. Tell them you thought of them. It might be the wagon on their road. And third, subscribe and stay, because this is a place where we tell these kinds of stories. Stories about the discarded who rise, the underestimated who reckon, the quiet ones who walk out with nothing and come back owning the lumberyard. And I would be honored to have you in that community. Then drop me 1 line in the comments, just 1. Tell me the exact moment you would have walked out through the kitchen. Was it the word hollow? Was it the blank page? Was it the nursery? I read them all. And I will see you on the next staircase, standing a little taller, taking nothing their hands have given, and going, at last, to build.